Welcome all to Reading Library. I'm Tom Landy. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture, and sponsor of tonight's event. And throughout the year, the McFarland Center sponsors and co-sponsors programs for students, faculty, and staff that tackle important questions about meaning, morality, and mutual obligations. We have a robust calendar of lectures and discussions scheduled for the fall, including a visit from Nobel Peace Prize laureate, Russian journalist Dmitry Muratov, a week from today. You can find all of our upcoming events and programs and recordings of many of them online at holycross.edu/McFarland Center. And this is our home and Reading Library, so I'm glad you're here. Tonight, I'm really pleased to host, albeit in a kind of virtual format. We've talked before, we get to do that again here. Cornell University philosopher Kate Manne for a discussion on misogyny, concepts, targets, and triggers. I'm grateful to my faculty colleagues who encouraged us to invite Kate, who introduced me to her work after reading her book, Down Girl, in the discussion group that the McFarland Center sponsored on gender and political violence a few years ago before COVID, which seems like, what, 100 years ago, but not that long ago. The 50th anniversary of co-education at Holy Cross, which we're just beginning to mark, is an apt time to consider the ethical obligations for the well-being of our students, our women students, all women, in fact. Kate Manne is a philosopher and associate professor at the Sage School of Philosophy at Cornell University. She published two critically acclaimed books, Down Girl, The Logic of Misogyny in 2018, and Entitled How Male Privilege Hurts Women in 2020. She's currently working on a third book about diet culture and the violence of Fat Phobia. And I believe she'll draw on all three of those works tonight, and you can ask questions around that. She doesn't go into the new book, but we talked about that as a possibility. In addition to scholarly articles on the foundations of morality, Kate has written dozens of opinion pieces, essays, and political commentary responding to misogyny in the news, which you can read online in The Atlantic, The Guardian, The New York Times, Boston Review, Washington Post, among others. While Kate joins us from Ithaca, New York, she can see all of us gathered here. And after Kate's talk, we'll open up the microphone. Danielle, who's here, will have a microphone to pass around so that she can answer your questions and engage with you as well. So please join me in welcoming Kate Manne. Welcome, Kate.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Professor Landy for that wonderful introduction that I'm really honored by. And I'm just so pleased to be able to join you tonight, albeit virtually, and to be able to introduce some of these ideas that I've been developing over the past few years, and to have a conversation afterwards about misogyny and some of its many manifestations. So I'm going to share my slides now. I've entitled this lecture, What is Misogyny? Concepts, Targets, and Triggers, because what I want to do tonight is to share my basic framework for thinking about misogyny that I've been developing and applying for the last several years, and then to try to give you a sense of what the theory says about when misogyny will tend to kick in, who will be the characteristic targets of misogyny, and what kind of behavior will often trigger misogyny in ordinary social contexts. So misogyny is distinguished partly by how multifarious it is and how many different kinds of examples of it I could give. So I'm going to be giving you a smattering of some of those examples in three applications of the theory after I've laid out its basic tenets. My proposed definition of misogyny, I think, is a good place to start here. And what I hold is that misogyny is primarily a property not of individual agents' psychologies, but rather primarily a property of social systems or environments as a whole, in which girls and women face hostility and hatred that serves a particular function. And that function is to police and enforce patriarchal norms and expectations. So there's a lot of moving parts of that theory, but the basic idea metaphorically is that misogyny is something like the police force of patriarchy. It tries to bring people into line when girls and women have ideas beyond their station or are not behaving according to these gendered scripts that I'll be delving into further tonight. So a few just basic points about this definition before I introduce some contrast between my theory and some other possible theories and concepts. According to my view of this, misogyny is a structural phenomenon rather than an individual one. So in the first instance, what we have to do to diagnose misogyny is look at the social world or the environment or the system as a whole and ask, what are girls and women facing distinctively and disproportionately because of their gender? Together, as I'll get into in a moment, with other social factors to do with their social position. Things like race, class, being trans, being disabled, being fat, and so on. Misogyny is also, according to my view of it, a political phenomenon rather than a psychological one. So this isn't to say that misogyny has no psychological manifestations. I'm going to tell you in a couple of slides about how I do think there are individual agents who deserve to be called misogynists and who think in misogynistic ways. But that's not where the theory starts. We don't start by trying to define hate-filled individuals. We start by looking at impact, not intention, roughly. And then we can read off from misogyny as a social system some individuals within it who do particular harm, who I will hold deserve to be called misogynists. But we start with the system, not with the individual agent psychologies again. And a final point to note about this definition is that it is what I'd call a victim-centered approach to misogyny. So it says that misogyny is about what girls and women face and not what men feel. Because among other things, I hold that women, girls, as well as even perhaps non-binary folks, in addition to men, can perpetuate misogyny, and so can social practices, institutions, and other more diffuse sources of misogynistic social pressures. So it's not just about individuals, and those individuals needn't be men in any case. Okay, so a crucial point of contrast in beginning this work on misogyny was what I called the naive definition of misogyny. So one thing I was trying to oppose when I began this work was a tendency that I found in public discourse to try to, in effect, define misogyny out of existence. The discourse would go something like this. Someone would commit an egregiously violent act that seemed targeted to girls and women in particular. And then there would be a question, does this person fit the definition of a misogynist, where misogyny is held according to this naive dictionary-style definition to be primarily a property of individual agents who hate any and every girl or woman, or at least they hate girls and women very generally. And if misogyny was something like this, then you could rebut the accusation of misogyny by simply saying about this hate-filled individual, well, he loves his mother, so he can't be a misogynist. Or, well, he only targets women who he finds sexually desirable. We'll see an example of that in one of my applications of this view. And it seemed to me that that was, in effect, making misogyny an almost non-existent phenomenon for reasons of moral psychology that can be summarized as follows. If patriarchy trains girls and women to be very deferential and often subservient, submissive, compliant, cooperative, then it would be very unusual for a hate-filled individual to extend hatred to absolutely any girl or woman, including girls and women who are highly serviceable to that person. Now, he might have contempt for girls and women, he might have certain kinds of resentments, but it seems to me to be setting the bar way too high to require that a misogynist hate and rail against even girls and women who are on his side, soothing and serving him. So why bite the hand that soothes and serves you doesn't really make sense. And so this naive definition of misogyny that some dictionaries still espouse makes misogyny an almost non-existent phenomenon, I hold, and also one that it's very difficult to form justified beliefs about. Because it's very difficult to know if someone hates any and every girl or woman. You'd almost have to go around and see just how prevalent their attitudes were. So that is part of the reason that I proposed the definition of misogyny that I do, that allows that misogyny can target groups of girls and women very selectively. And what this means is that this is offered as an intersectional feminist approach to misogyny that says it counts as misogyny even if it is targeting girls and women with further demographic characteristics, such as, for example, commonly in the US, Black women will face distinctive kinds of misogyny that the queer Black theorist Moya Bailey and her collaborator, the Trudes, have labeled misogynoir. And this will count as a specific and distinctively harmful form of misogyny on my theory, because we're not holding that misogyny has to target absolutely any and every girl or woman. We're holding that it can target particular women in particular groups who are perceived as having certain behaviors, and that will become important when we get to targets and triggers, but also women who are Black, women who are trans, women who are disabled, women who are queer, women who are fat. It counts as misogyny if it meets this definition of mine, according to the views that I've been developing. And I should say that while I've labeled it the naive definition of misogyny and say that some dictionaries still go in for that definition, it's actually interesting that the dictionary definition for the term misogyny has evolved over recent years, with several dictionaries advocating a broader definition of the term. Even the dictionary has updated somewhat to reflect the fact that misogyny needn't take this form that I've tried to capture with the naive definition. Okay, so to summarize, there's no supposition on this view that misogyny will target any and every girl or woman. It may target girls and women selectively, given other intersecting social positions they occupy. Here drawing on Professor Kimberly Crenshaw's crucial framework of intersectionality, which says that the discrimination faced by, for example, Black women is more than the sum of the parts of facing discrimination as a woman and as Black. Black women face a distinctive form of harm as one example of intersectionality. Okay, so I'm going to now contrast my definition of misogyny with my definition of sexism before delving into how you can tell if you're facing misogyny on the view that I am defending. So I have again my definition of misogyny on the slide, and I hold that in contrast to misogyny, sexism is something distinctive. It is primarily a set of beliefs, cultural narratives, and other facets of ideology that function to rationalize and naturalize a patriarchal social order. So it depicts women oftentimes as naturally well-suited to particular feminine coded roles like caregiving, and it depicts men as naturally well-suited to masculine coded positions of leadership, political authority, intellectual authority, certain sports, and other roles associated with and reserved for, in particular, privileged men. So a way to think about it on this theory is that sexism is the ideological branch of patriarchy. It's kind of wearing the white lab coat, doing the bad science, and it is very bad science. None of these views about the naturalness of all of this really hold up, as we can discuss more in the Q&A. But sexism is the bad science here, and misogyny is the active, dynamic police force of patriarchy. So in a slogan, sexism wears the lab coat and misogyny goes on witch hunts. Sexism has a theory about how the world is when it comes to gender, which, by the way, often reinforces a false and pernicious gender binary that denies the humanity and existence of trans and non-binary folks. So that's one pernicious form of sexism. And then misogyny forces the world to be a certain way. It tries to insist on the patriarchal status quo when it's ongoing, or to reiterate and reinstantiate the status quo if there's a threat of feminist social progress. So misogyny tries to turn back the clock of time and make the world the way it allegedly once was when these social roles were policed and enforced so effectively that there was fewer ripples under the social surface of dissent and conflict. So I hope that makes sense, at least as a preliminary way of thinking about this sexism misogyny contrast. So I hold they're distinct things that work together in tandem as forces within patriarchy. Okay. So now I want to delve into the epistemology of misogyny a little bit, because a really natural question to ask about my view is, well, how can you tell you're faced with misogyny according to the view that I am defending? And in fact, one of the advertised benefits of my view about misogyny is that it's meant to make it easier to tell from the perspective of a victim or target of misogyny, whether you are in fact facing misogyny. So here's the basic, and I take it not very surprising, recipe for thinking about the epistemology of misogyny. That is how we know or justifiably believe that we're faced with misogyny. I should have said epistemology just being this fancy philosophical word for how we know or justifiably believe something. So in my view, we can know or reasonably justifiably believe that girls and women face misogyny in as much as they're facing disproportionate or distinctively hostile and hateful attitudes, actions, practices, institutions, artworks, and so on, which serve this relevant policing and enforcement mechanism that serve to try to uphold or reinstantiate patriarchy. So here's just an example of disproportionate hostility. So it turns out that when women write for a public audience, regardless of the subject matter, it seems that they face disproportionate amounts of hostility for having an online presence or giving voice to their opinions. So this was a kind of very unsurprising result found by a study done by The Guardian. So The Guardian in the UK found that 8 of the 10 writers who attracted the most abuse in the online comments section were women, and women of color were particularly affected by this. The 2 remaining writers were men of color. There were, unfortunately, they didn't look at non-binary authors who I think would have attracted similarly disproportionate hostility for sure. And 10 of 10 of those who attracted the least amount of hostility were men, predominantly white men. So this was a study that lends credence to the common sense idea that girls and women often face disproportionate hostility for expressing their views online, at least in contexts like that of writing opinion pieces for The Guardian, which we'll see an example of in a moment. Now, you don't necessarily have to look to distinctively gendered hostility to justify saying this was misogyny. The other way I think you can tell is seeing that it is distinctively gendered hostility. So, for example, someone using a gendered epithet like bitch, among other choice terms that are frequently used in misogynistic abuse, both on and offline, that will count as misogyny, according to this kind of analysis, as will things like rape threats that, again, women face disproportionately, although not exclusively. So I hope that's reasonably clear that you can look to either the disproportionate impact or the disparate, distinctively gendered impact to see, is this plausibly a case of misogyny on this analysis? You don't need to check that any and every woman has been subject to the same hostility. in order to confirm its misogyny on this way of looking at things that I espouse. Okay, so as promised, I want now to delve into how do we think about what a misogynist is, having given a definition of misogyny. So although I hold that misogyny is primarily this property of social environments, as I've outlined, I think we can say that there are misogynists within the system. So I'm not someone who says that there is misogyny, but no misogynists. I think there absolutely are misogynists about, unfortunately. I think misogyny can exist without misogynists in theory. So there could just be misogynistic institutions in the absence of misogynistic individuals. But I think usually in practice, we do find individuals who deserve to be called misogynists. And my way of characterizing what qualifies someone for this dubious and pejorative label is that I want to say an individual agent is a misogynist in as much as they're particularly and or consistently liable to channel and or perpetuate misogyny relative to others in their social environment. So this makes misogyny a threshold term for, roughly speaking, overachievers in a misogynistic social system. So the people practicing a great deal of misogyny are the ones who get called misogynists. And that makes misogyny a kind of warning label that potential victims and targets of misogyny, namely girls and women, particularly those most vulnerable to other intersecting forms of oppression, can use to warn each other about potentially egregious offenders and people who are particularly likely to do them harm in this way. All right, so I hope that gives the basic contours of my theory. And now I want to look at a paradigm case of misogyny and draw out a few lessons before turning to some more applications. So I have here just a few screenshots. I don't intend for you to read the text here, but just a few visuals from an interesting article written by Lindy West, who is a feminist writer and prominent fat activist who has written fabulous books like her memoir Shrill and another book of essays, The Witches Are Coming, among other books. And the story, the background to this example that I'm going to give you of misogyny is that Lindy West wrote her feminist and anti-fat phobic online opinion pieces for The Guardian, amongst other venues, for years, and was subject to an enormous amount of misogynistic trolling. Now, the man who she calls her cruelest troll, what he did is he set up an online account, email and Twitter, where he imitated her recently deceased beloved father, who's pictured here. And he had in his bio read, dead father of an idiot, Lindy West, other two kids are fine though. So he trolled Lindy West by imitating her dead father, who she was actively mourning at the time, actively grieving for, and wrote these screeds about how stupid and wrong she was. And Lindy West wrote an online piece about what it was like to be subject to this abuse. And amazingly enough, it actually got through to her cruelest troll, who wrote her a note apologizing for his behavior. He said, look, I was experiencing all this self-loathing. You just seemed to not hate yourself, and that made me really angry. And eventually, a few years later, she reached back out to him after he'd apologized and said, could I interview you? I want to understand, what was your motivation for trolling me like this? Do you have any insight into what made you such a misogynist? And how did you reform? Why did you apologize? So on and so forth. So it's kind of an amazing story, because it's rare that not only does an apology happen in this kind of context, but that, as you'll see in a moment, this guy had a lot of insight into his own behavior and his own reason for being so cruel and targeting Lindy West in particular. So here is this interview that she did for the very well-known radio show and podcast, This American Life. So the man, her former reform troll, said, by way of explanation as to why he trolled her, when you talked about being proud of who you are and where you are and where you're going, that kind of stoked that anger that I had. Okay, so you found my writing, and you did not like it. Certain aspects of it, you used a lot of all caps. You almost have no fear when you write. You know, it's like you stand on the desk and you say, I'm Lindy West, and this is what I believe in. F you if you don't agree with me. And even though you don't say those words exactly, I'm like, who is this bitch who thinks she knows everything? And Lindy West explains in the interview that she asked him if he felt that way because she was a woman. So was this misogyny in at least one way of understanding it? The man says, oh, definitely, definitely. Women are being more forthright in their writing. There isn't a sense of timidity to when they speak or when they write. They're saying it loud. And I think that for me, it's threatening at first. Lindy West says, right. You must know that that's why I do that, because people don't expect to hear from women like that. And I want other women to see me do that. And I want other women's voices to get louder. The man finishes, and here I'll end the excerpt. I understand. Here's the thing. I work with women all day and I don't have an issue with anyone. I could have told you back then if someone had said to me, oh, you're a misogynist, you hate women. And I could have said, nah, I love my mom. I love my sisters. I've loved the girlfriends that I've had in my life. But you can't claim to be okay with women and then go online and insult them, seek them out to harm them emotionally. So I think that this is exactly right. Misogynists can love their moms, their sisters, their girlfriends, their daughters, and they often claim this when they're defending themselves against charges of misogyny. But it's misogyny's characteristic to target women like West who are perceived as not conforming to patriarchal norms and expectations. So here is where we get into the idea that misogyny has characteristic targets and triggers. Not all the time. I think almost anyone can be a potential victim of misogyny as a girl or woman. However, I think that misogyny typically in this kind of paradigm case targets girls and women who, like West, was perceived and served as a representative example of a woman who violates, challenges, and or resists gendered norms and expectations of a patriarchal nature. And we can see that West did this in several ways. There was what West was saying, so her being a feminist writer, among other things. There was who she was in saying it, namely a successful and unapologetically fat woman with a platform who often wrote in support of other fat people's right to simply exist in public, which is a theme that is now dear to my heart as someone writing about the intersection of misogyny and fat phobia. And there was also how Lindy West was saying it. As the man noted in his interview with her, she was saying it in an outspoken way. So unapologetic, unshrinking. So whereas historically, there's often been a patriarchal norm and expectation that women will defer to others' views, be self-effacing, cooperative, compliant, submissive, not too loud, meek, small, quiet, etc. And Lindy West's violation of those norms, I think, is why she entitled her memoir Shrill, because of the perception that a woman's voice is shrill when she's merely speaking her mind in a forthright manner. So the conclusion of this is that misogyny's classic target will be a non-conforming woman in various ways, including, I would absolutely add, trans women who face the distinctive form of misogyny known as trans misogyny that we should all be highly concerned about. And misogyny will often be triggered by what is at least perceived as gender deviant behavior. So a woman who is perceived as in some way threatening or unbecoming, or as not fulfilling her proper patriarchal role within the society as we know it, she will be the person who is most likely to come in for misogynistic abuse and so on. Now, I should say that I don't hold that only women who are behaving in a non-conforming way will be the victim of misogyny, just as it might be true that a police force primarily targets people who it believes to be wrongdoers, but there is also such a thing as, and especially in this country, I believe, over-policing, where people who are even completely following the letter of the law will come in for these over-policing tactics. So I think that misogyny's capacity to harm just about any girl or woman stems from this possibility of over-policing, but it is still useful to view the prime target of misogyny as the non-conforming woman who exhibits gender deviant behavior, even though misogyny's reach can massively exceed its grasp. Okay, so just a few points about what misogyny is not. So as I've said now, I think a number of times, misogyny is perfectly compatible with, and indeed quite conducive to, loving, attentive, devoted mothers, wives, daughters, secretaries, nurses, etc. People who are channeling misogynistic social forces will often, in fact, put certain women on a pedestal in as much as they conform to gendered norms and expectations about women being serviceable, compliant, submissive, and giving a great deal in terms of reproductive, material, emotional, and other forms of labor, sexual labor as well. And a second point to note here, which I won't spend too long on in the interest of time, but that we could definitely talk more about in the Q&A, is that on this framework, misogyny need not and often will not involve dehumanizing women, because women are human, all too human in the minds of many misogynists. So one way to bring this out quickly is that in the example I just gave you of this paradigm case of misogyny with Lindy West, she was perceived by her troll as shrill, outspoken, opinionated, and a know-it-all. These are all distinctively human sins and attributes. So it wasn't that he somehow thought she was less than human, I take it. It's that he thought she was behaving in an uppity way, that the particular kind of human she is as a woman was not entitled to exhibit. So one way that I often try to get at this is that women are positioned socially within a patriarchy, not as human beings, but rather as human givers, people who are responsible for giving in terms of love, care, support, nurture, and so on. So those are a few points about what misogyny is not. Okay, so to just kind of summarize where we are, I've defended the idea that misogyny is a structural phenomenon, not a primarily individual one, a political one, not primarily a psychological one, and it's about what girls and women face, not what men feel. That's how I think we ought to understand the term misogyny in order for it to be a politically useful and epistemologically tractable concept that we can actually know things about in the environment that we're navigating. So this is meant to be a concept of misogyny that is empowering for potential victims and targets. Okay, so I now want to draw out a few connections with views about what is kind of driving some of this misogynistic ongoing behavior, attitudes, actions, practices, and institutions, and then to give a few applications of the theory that I hope will show how multifarious misogyny can be according to this conception. So one thing that you'll have noticed re-arising in the discussion many times is I keep saying this phrase, patriarchal norms and expectations. And an obvious immediate question you might have about this is, well, what are these patriarchal norms and expectations that misogyny serves to police and enforce? Particularly in America today, which some people, at least when I was starting to write about this, maybe less so now, Some people would allege that America is actually post-feminist, and the same is true of my native country of Australia, which you can probably tell from my funny hybrid accent where I'm where I'm from. But in these superficially more egalitarian and feminist societies, what are these existing patriarchal norms and expectations? I mean, it's not like we have a strong norm anymore that women don't work and merely stay at home with children. Not that there's anything wrong with doing that if that's your jam, but we don't expect that that's the only legitimate path for a woman. In fact, about 40% of American households have a female primary breadwinner, just as an example. So here's what I hold to be the answer to this question I've just raised. So I think that these patriarchal norms and expectations in these allegedly post-patriarchal contexts are primarily a matter of a false sense that privileged men are entitled to certain goods from similarly or less privileged girls and women in the form of sex, love, care, labor, including reproductive labor, like having their children, admiration, consent, control, support, power, deference. Yeah, all of this. And one way of looking at this is that these entitlements mean that, look, a woman is welcome to go out and work and earn money to support her family, but they feed into the practice of women performing what the sociologist Ali Russell Hochschild calls the second shift. So women perform a far greater proportion of domestic and child-rearing labor in heterosexual relationships when the couple has children. Again, if it's a male-female relationship. There is a prevalent sense of male entitlement that means that women do twice as much domestic labor and child-rearing labor as their male partners in contexts where they both work full-time. So she's perceived as responsible for a huge amount of catering to other people's sense of entitlement. And the second shift problem, by the way, hasn't gotten any better in 20 years. So contrary to the common supposition that men are doing more around the house now or caring for their children more actively, we actually haven't seen an uptick in the amount of hours men put in if they're married to a woman, again, with children, in 20 years, since roughly 2000. Moreover, there is only one context in which men do almost as much work, domestic and child-rearing work, as women. That's when she works full-time and he is unemployed. She'll still do a bit more on average, but then they'll start to approach parity. And again, that's when she's working full-time and he is not working at all. So this sense of entitlement to this care, service, and domestic as well as emotional labor is, I think, the prevalent form that patriarchy takes today. And the flip side of this, the very unfortunate flip side that I also want to gesture at least, is that girls and women are not deemed entitled to these goods, even when they're genuinely entitled to them. So the flip side of this is women and girls get really the short shrift when it comes to the care and emotional support that they are entitled to as well. So this is, a very asymmetrical, very unjust picture that I'm going to paint. And I think it affects many or infects many facets of life, from the domestic realm to the dating realm, to thinking about knowledge and epistemic practices, to thinking about political power and authority, to thinking about healthcare and the medical system. So I'm just going to give you 3 different examples where I think this uneven system of entitlement that misogyny enforces is operative. And I could give you, 5 times as many examples if we had the time, but I'm just going to give you 3 to give you a taste of what I think this theory predicts and how it, what its contours are in terms of its concrete applications. Okay. So here's my first application of the theory. This is the phenomenon of incels. Now, these are, if you haven't heard the term before, it's a term that's short for involuntary celibate. These are young, or typically young, invariably cis, het, or so-called straight men who embody a sense of entitlement to sex, yes, to some extent, but still more insidiously to care, love, affection, and particularly sexual admiration from women. So the kind of patron saint of incels, for lack of a better term here, is Elliot Roger, who I have, whose picture I've posted on the slide with reservations about including this image, but I think it is nonetheless a powerful one. He's pictured here behind the wheel of his BMW shortly after he had posted a video that was the last in a series of YouTube videos where he swore to wreak revenge on the hot women who wouldn't date him or even look at him, he felt. He actually had never approached these women, he'd merely stalked them from a distance, but he felt that he was entitled to their sexual admiration. So he said in this YouTube rant, "You girls have never been attracted to me. I don't know why you girls aren't attracted to me, but I will punish you all for it. It's an injustice, a crime. I don't know what you don't see in me. I'm the perfect guy. Girls, all I ever wanted was to love you." Here he switches to the second person plural, "and to be loved by you. I've wanted a girlfriend, I've wanted sex, I've wanted love, affection, adoration. You think I'm unworthy of it? That's a crime that will never be forgiven." Again, I think it's useful here to hear from such a, in my book, unapologetic misogynist, in as much as he's actually very clear about his own motives and overall kind of attitudinal structure. He views himself as entitled to something women are not providing him with or giving him in the form of sexual admiration, among other things, and he views that as morally wrong. And he plans to punish women for not giving him the goods to which he felt entitled to. So that would count and does count in my writing about this as a classic and particularly violent case of misogyny, given that he went on to murder two women who were students at UCSB in May 2014, after he tried to, in fact, eviscerate an entire sorority house full of female students at UCSB. He was denied entry and settled for shooting three young women walking outside around the corner. Only one of them survived and two were murdered by him. He also murdered four other people that day before committing suicide. So this is a really grim tale, this so-called Isla Vista killing by Elliot Roger, and it shows how incredibly violent a sense of misogynistic entitlement can be at its worst. Okay, so here's a second example of misogyny and the ways in which misogyny is promulgated through this differential system of entitlements of men versus women. So I hold that another really important example of this is the lack of entitlement girls and women are perceived as having to basic healthcare. Particularly, this is faced by Black and Indigenous women in the US context. I could also say poor women, although there is sadly and unjustly a lot of overlap between those groups. So girls and women, again, especially girls and women of color, suffering from pain and health problems are routinely dismissed as hysterical, oversensitive, and even as malingerers. So there is a lot of evidence that starting from a very young age, boys' pain is perceived as more real and serious than girls' pain, even if it is video footage of the same infant crying and just dressed in differently gender-coded clothing. Similarly, boys are often given stronger painkillers for the same health problems and following the same surgeries as compared to girls, So the boy will be prescribed opiates, the girl Tylenol. And that's not to say that it's necessarily a good thing to be prescribed opiates, because of course we all know there's problems of opiate dependency that can arise. But just to say, given the medical paradigm as it exists, boys' pain is perceived as more serious than girls, and this extends to adult men versus women as well. I wish there was more research done here on how this plays out for non-binary folks. I strongly suspect that they face many of the same challenges as women and then some, but unfortunately there's a paucity of research on that topic. But another area in which this manifests, this lack of entitlement on the part of girls and women of color, is that Black and Indigenous women in the US have 3 to 4 times the rate of maternal mortality as compared to white counterparts, who already face pretty poor health outcomes in the US's system, which will only get worse in the wake of the Dobbs decision. So Black and Indigenous women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die following or during childbirth as compared to white women. And this makes maternal healthcare in the US some of the worst in the so-called developed world. So I trace these inequities in the medical system where girls and women, especially again, girls and women of color, are particularly vulnerable to the pernicious sense that girls and women are deemed obligated to provide or give care and are not entitled to ask for or receive it. Okay, so you can see there's both the examples that I've given you of an overabundant sense of entitlement on men's part and an insufficient sense of entitlement on behalf of girls and women to things they are genuinely entitled to in moral reality, like healthcare. Okay, so here is a third application, and this is my final example for the night. So here I want to look at a less morbid example, but still a serious one, of the difficulties in obtaining leadership positions for women. And I'm just going to talk you briefly through a study that really shed some light on this matter. So the researchers on this research team compared perceptions of 2 personnel files that were identical and were just named either James or Andrea and switched for every second participant in the study. So on average, participants received identical information about these 2 employees to be compared, one a man, one a woman, again, just alternating who was called James, the male coded name, and who was called Andrea, the female coded name. And these were held to be leaders, assistant vice presidents at an aircraft company. So Andrea was perceived in this first condition as less competent than James by 86% of participants, again, despite the fact that these people were receiving identical information about these 2 people on average. Under this condition, however, the people were perceived as similarly likable. So that's interesting. Then we get to the next variant of this experiment, where now we give people, I say we, I didn't do this research. For the perspective of the researchers, they gave people information that these 2 candidates were equally competent by holding them to be in the top 5% of AVPs at all comparable companies. So both highly competent, undeniably so. So when Andrea was explicitly portrayed as just as competent as James, now 83% of people, so nearly as many, judged James to be more likable than Andrea, and Andrea to be far more interpersonally hostile than James, that is, conniving, pushy, selfish, abrasive, manipulative, and untrustworthy. So upwards of 80% of participants in these experiments found the man to be preferable to the woman on the basis of the same information, and holding the man to be the more competent one if there was any ambiguity in who might be more competent, and holding the man to be more likable if they were unequivocally held to be equally competent. So interestingly, participant gender made no difference to these findings, showing that women as well as men can show this preference towards male leaders, especially in male-coded fields like an aeronautics company. So the final variant of this is they asked, could these biases against women in favor of men be undone? And it turned out they could. The way you do it is you have to portray both James and Andrea as extremely competent and communal, kind, caring, considerate of others' needs, and so on, in which case the bias against Andrea vanished or was even reversed in some cases. So it seemed that what participants were inferring is that a highly competent, successful female leader was a bitch, basically. Not a term I would ever use, but that was the kind of mindset people had about female leaders, unless that was explicitly contradicted by information about her being a super caring person. I have a little picture of Elizabeth Warren here to suggest that some of her popularity, I think, which, by the way, I was a big fan of hers, but some of her popularity, I think, was due to the fact that she was perceived as not just very smart and competent, but also as a super caring. So caring, she did over 100,000 selfies with constituents and other voters by the beginning of 2020. It wasn't enough, of course, in the end, which is unsurprising given these biases are very sticky, and the perception that someone is sufficiently communal might be easy to undo, given media biases and other misogynistic mechanisms, among other factors. So when it comes to exceptional communality, it's a must for female but not male leaders, seemingly. So I should finish up, but here is the broader upshot of what I've talked about here tonight. I hope that this framework helps to expose and unify male, especially white male entitlement in its many apparently disparate forms so that we can recognize and resist it. I wanted to give you a taste too of the idea that girls and women, as well as I think non-binary people, are often deprived of what they're genuinely entitled to, so that they might be able to claim it with at least awareness of the liability to be in for misogynistic punishment, and perhaps sometimes the tools to resist it. And to encourage us to address the collective action problems on and offline that will enable misogynistic social structures to remain entrenched. So those are the action items, and I hope that this at least gives you a taste of the kind of framework I've been developing and the kinds of examples it can hopefully shed some light on. Thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to your questions.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I wanted to ask a quick question about the kind of home life balance between a dad and a mother. You mentioned that there hasn't really been much improvement in the past 20 years. I was wondering if there's been any research as to why that's been, or what this kind of like stagnant stop has been about, because I mean, as far as I'm concerned, there was some progress happening and then it appears like it's sort of maybe halted. So I was just wondering if there was a little bit more into that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I do think it comes back, reading between the lines of this research, to an issue of entitlement. So what they find is that dads do a lot more in the way of leisure activities, personal projects like, playing on a sports team, and watching, various kinds of television, including like, following sports and so on. And it seems like mothers in these, again, this is applicable only to heterosexual partnerships, mothers in these contexts have a lot less of a sense of entitlement to pursue leisure activities and also rest. So they found, looking at time use diaries, that men slept more than women. So men got more sleep and more leisure, and women were doing a lot more of the, I guess, what some people call, and I'm tempted to echo this, emotional labor, as well as kind of just general noticing labor. So noticing what needed doing, keeping track of it all, as well as the sheer material labor that's needed to run a household. So yeah, I do think we need to challenge this idea that is implicit and that I think many people don't agree with, but that plays out implicitly or covertly, that men are more entitled to time, leisure, sleep, rest, and women are less entitled to these goods. Another aspect of it was that in terms of actual distribution of childcare, men would do more of the fun things with kids, so playing with the baby or kicking a ball around, and women would do more of the somewhat less fun tasks like changing diapers and doing laundry and stuff that most of us at least find to be more drudgery than joy. So yeah, this is a kind of existing very sticky source of inequity within these partnerships, and lots of women within them reported dissatisfaction and resentment, but often didn't feel empowered to change the distribution of labor because of partly worrying of being perceived as various misogynistic stereotypes like a nag and so on.
Hey, do you know in these studies, did men underestimate the differentials that you're talking about? Were men aware of them, or were they thinking they did better?
They did. It still wouldn't be even close to 50-50, but men did tend to overestimate the amount of time they actually spent doing both child rearing and domestic activities. Women overestimated too, though. We all tend to overestimate. Women proportionately overestimated a bit less. But yeah, it looked like that was one source of it, but not the only source.
I have a question about what the system created by men and that is run by men and still today predominantly run by men. And with the question you just answered earlier, saying that women don't feel empowered to speak up or say something to change the labor force when it comes to raising a child, do you believe that in order to create a less misogynist world or to terminate it, do you feel that it's men's responsibility or women themselves should feel empowered to speak up about it, or do you feel like some sort of allyship should be formed?
Yeah, what a great question. I think it's mostly on men, honestly, to do better. I know that's not a popular answer or a politic one, but the truth is when women do speak up about this, they often get punished in a misogynistic way. So I can understand where women are coming from in not necessarily insisting on fairness. This is reflected a little bit in well-known advice to women to negotiate for better salaries. So the wage gap, as some of you may know from studying this, is super complicated, and it's not quite as simple as women earning, I think it's now 79 cents on the dollar. It varies. This is a much bigger problem for mothers than for other women. It's a much bigger problem at certain strata economically. But whatever the case, the classic advice to tackle existing wage gap problems has been, look, women, just negotiate better, be more assertive, be more, empowered to ask for what you're worth. But the truth is, studies subsequent to this showed that women who did that got punished and often ended up earning even less and having less respect at work because they were perceived as abrasive in a way that I think does, broadly jive with what the Heilman studies that I just summarized are saying. Because, yeah, women who are perceived as seeking more power or more money are perceived as overly entitled and too ambitious and too aggressive a lot of the time. So I think we both have to change the systems, the structures, and I think, there's a lot of this where there has to be reform of male attitudes, and that does look hard to do, but not impossible. I think progress has been made on it, and we will continue to make progress. But this is an issue where I think it's not as simple as women empowering themselves. There are just a lot of barriers to accessing a more just world when you'll be punished for asking for what you are owed. and for not giving people more than they're entitled to when it comes to privileged men who are deemed the proper recipient of that care and support and deference.
How should a woman respond if she's feeling in a like misogynistic situation? Like if someone says something that's like misogynistic to her, like how should she respond to not seem like pushy and mean?
Yeah. So I think there are two questions here. One is like what's safe to do, and the other is assuming you're in a safe environment where you're also not too worried about fallout or reprisal, what would be effective? So the first question will obviously be really context dependent. Like there are lots of contexts where women might hesitate quite understandably and reasonably to speak out against misogyny leveled at them or other women because their safety is on the line. So for example, if someone is being catcalled in a misogynistic way, there are often real safety concerns that mean, I certainly think anyone is entitled to push back against such unjust treatment, but I also don't think they're obligated to do so because they might be, either worried about their safety or in some instances, it's hard to always have the energy to respond. However, if you're in a situation where it's safe and you do want to push back against misogyny, then I think that's awesome. And I think the studies that I flagged at the end give a clue as to what will often be effective. What will often be effective is emphasizing that misogyny is harmful to many people. And so there are communal reasons and not just self-interested ones to ask for misogyny to end, to point out that this is something that impacts a huge number of women. I think arguably that it impacts all women and girls, and that is something that is very harmful and hurtful, not just to the particular target or victim of misogyny, but in a much broader social sense. I think that will sometimes detract from potential perception that the woman is being shrill or abrasive in her pushback. So emphasizing that you're coming at this from the perspective of someone who, yes, is defending herself and trying to minimize the misogyny she faces, but is aware that this is like a broader social scheme that means that women in general are being harmed, and that matters. I'm not saying that will always be effective, but I think sometimes that will help somewhat mitigate the sense that there's something hysterical or overreacting in someone as the target of misogyny pushing back against it. Does that make sense, that you can invoke broader values like, I think what you're saying does harm. I think, the word you just used for women is demeaning to girls and women more broadly, and that matters. And then, it's up to the person to take responsibility for how they respond to that.
Hey, can I ask, because you've described this as a systemic structural problem, and a couple of questions that we handled could be sort of, what do individuals do? What kind of systemic structural responses do you look for in the future for responding to it? Because the question, what does an individual say back, or what does an individual man have as a responsibility?
I mean, I think about this partly as an issue of how do we think about online spaces being safer and more accessible for many people with vulnerabilities. I mean, here's just one structural change that was helpful. The Guardian no longer allows comments on opinion pieces. And unsurprisingly, that meant that once that change was made, female writers, and especially female writers of color, faced a lot less abuse because people didn't start to get going in the comments and then end up emailing or tweeting or whatever else. It was sort of a way of shutting off at the knees something which is, it's all too easy to hold forth anonymously in a comment section in horribly misogynistic ways. And that minor structural change of just not inviting a response, yes, it has costs because you also didn't get the potential, public space and forum for discussion that can be valuable in some contexts. But I think it was right in this particular one to think that wasn't the place for it, because of the cost to certain people over others. We can think more generally about how we make certain spaces more, more hostile to hostility. So this will have manifestations both on and offline. A lot of people are thinking seriously about how, if it was actually motivated to do so, a place like Twitter could be reformed to be less conducive to, for example, hate speech. Then there are similar kinds of questions that arise about our institutions of higher learning as well, which I think is something that, fortunately is being actively thought through, how to create spaces that are both conducive to vigorous public discussion and disagreement of a healthy kind, and a kind of foster democratic participation, but also are safe for people to speak out in as equals. I think thinking about this both from the perspective of an individual who has to navigate the world as it is, and from the perspective of designing better and more misogyny-resistant spaces is important. Here's just one more thought. If you have options, don't run competitions where women and men go head to head. It's just like a really concrete structural change that it's not always practicable, but if you can avoid the direct head-to-head competition between men and women, you will tend to reduce some of the most prevalent biases that position men over women. And you see some of the positive impacts of that in education, where women do really, really well when they're graded as individuals rather than compared to potential rivals, where there would be this potential favoritism that we see in the Heilman studies as a very powerful social force. Contrast something like that to a political system where men and women have to engage in a head-to-head race for any position of political authority, and you'll see many more problems with women being recognized or gaining power or acknowledgement in that kind of structural context. So does that make sense as one of the design features or bugs that it's worth thinking about? Yeah, can we avoid this kind of head-to-head comparison that seems like a really ripe arena for bias?
Thank you so much for the research. It's very informative. I was just wondering a bit more about discrimination one might face in a predominantly male workplace, and also if that can impact just generally this perspective of women.
Could you just say that last sentence again? I just had a little trouble hearing. Sorry.
I was just wondering if, if being a woman in a predominantly male workplace impacts the way the office or just the workplace in general would view women.
Yeah, so I do think some of these challenges can be even more pronounced in a male workplace, where there's a kind of culture of male dominance. And, I think there's a really strong argument here for, something which a lot of people now fortunately believe in, which is that more diverse workplaces, among other things, are a major force for gender justice, especially since a lot of these arguments are about what is male coded and what sorts of barriers women face in male coded environments. And the more actually male dominated a space is, the more it feeds into the perception that it's a masculine coded pursuit. So for example, in my own discipline of philosophy, we're very male dominated, with the most male as well as white dominated space in the humanities, and are roughly on par with the so-called pure maths and sciences, which does make it difficult to push back against the perception that authority within this domain is something that is not gendered. So yeah, I think that is a part of the picture, is that it is hard to be a woman in a male dominated space, partly for that reason. And, that is certainly a reality. I think one thing I would say by way of caution, and again, this is kind of a bummer, is the unfortunate thing though, is just because there are women in a space doesn't automatically make it gender friendly. It doesn't automatically make it it tends to improve it as an empirical matter, but we've seen ways in which women as well as men can perpetuate misogyny and implicit forms of gender bias, sometimes just as much as their male counterparts. So for example, if you're imagining participants in the last studies that I mentioned, having more women in the room who share the same prevalent biases wouldn't help to elect more female leaders in the kinds of contexts that I just named. So I certainly think there are extra barriers to women in male-dominated spaces, but I think in all patriarchal contexts, which includes, unfortunately, most of the institutions and practices we have, there are barriers that women as well as men help to put in place and channel. And so it might be necessary, but not sufficient, to have a certain amount of gender diversity in order to improve the environment and make it friendlier and less hostile to women as well as other minorities.
Hi, thank you so much for being here again. I was just wondering if you could touch on the relationship or any relationship that you found between misogyny and diet culture.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. I mean, that's the topic of my new book. So I think part of it is that fat phobia and its kind of instrumental wing. So I think of fat phobia as ranking fat bodies as inferior to thinner bodies in terms of things like intellectual prowess, aesthetic or sexual value, as well as moral character, in addition to, of course, health status, which is a complicated matter. So I think one of the ways that this works to particularly impact women in this space is that so much of women's value is held to be in providing sexual services, in this provision of sexual as well as reproductive labor, that the thought is something like, if a woman is fat and thus judged to be less aesthetically and sexually meritorious or desirable, then her worth is vastly diminished, because that's what a lot of her worth consists in, is the ability to supply men with the kind of hot partner that a man like Elliot Roger felt entitled to. So women who kind of buck that trend or refuse that demand in their very bodies by not conforming to conventional standards of attractiveness that are fat phobic, often come in for misogynistic punishment for not just not giving men that to which they're deemed entitled, but being perceived as not being able to provide it in the form of providing that desirable source of sexual attention and service labor. So again, that's kind of a grim answer, but I hope it is illuminating to many people who have felt not just that I think misogyny often does involve a certain amount of objectification, but some feminist theorizing about objectification makes it seem like all women are presented as shiny objects, I think the reality is lots of women are depicted as tarnished objects in virtue of their bodies not conforming to the sorts of patriarchal norms and expectations that at this historical moment say that a woman ought to be thin, as well as white, as well as non-disabled, as well as cis, as well as straight, and thus an ideal provider, and also young, I should say, and thus a provider of this kind of sexual and reproductive labor that we're trained and socialized to think that similarly privileged men are entitled to, and that she's obligated to provide him with. So, in a way, fat women are bodily rebels against this, whether we intend to be or not. And I think that is a powerful source of power, as well as a basis for being a target for misogyny, as the case of Lindy West shows. Does that answer the question about some of those potent intersections between fat phobia, which is manifest in the diet culture that says shrink yourself via various spurious means, and the misogyny that says certain women are more valuable than others because women are generally responsible for providing the kind of sexual and service labor that privileged men are deemed entitled to from them?
I do. It was to get back to the systemic, and I was going to return to wonderfully clear exposition, which I think gives us a lot to talk about and think about, and return to your example of the disparities in health and healthcare. You may know that at Boston Hospital, where research was being done in disparities in the delivery of medical care to Black and Indigenous women, there were violent protests against the very idea that they would actually be researched. And I was thinking of the fact that we have an important healthcare professions program here at Holy Cross, so there may be students here who are planning on careers in health professions. And one of the things that has begun to change, and certainly there's lots of space for further change and systemic progress, is in things like healthcare education, medical education, and also in terms of the protocols and policies of hospitals and other medical institutions. So I'm really glad that we pointed to this as one of your examples.
Yeah, I love that point. I actually didn't know about those protests or the antecedent freshen. I'd love to get the reference from you because it's something I'm super interested in an ongoing way. I also think it's worth noting that both the intersection of misogyny and fat phobia is really potent here. So medical fat phobia really affects it affects all fat bodies and people in fat bodies in the healthcare system, but particularly girls and women who are already often underserved, and that applies all the more to women who embody the intersections of being a woman, being fat, and being vulnerable in a further way, like being trans or being Black or being Indigenous, for example. Such we get egregious instances of medical neglect where often the ideas in popular culture is, well, fat people are just unhealthy. And, it's a complicated relationship between fatness and health that would be a presentation in its own right to really dig into. But suffice it to say that at least some of what's driving ill health is the fact that, when a fat person, particularly one who's multiply marginalized, goes to a doctor, they're often dismissed for health problems that are entirely unrelated to fatness and end up underdiagnosed and, in fact, the subject of contempt and derision, be it implicit or explicit, rather than getting proper compassionate healthcare to which they're entitled, such that their real medical problems go undiagnosed. And this manifests itself in empirical results like at autopsy, we find that fat people are 1.65 times more likely to have serious undiagnosed medical conditions, again, unrelated to fatness, like a heart infection or serious lung damage that is a plausible contributor to deaths that were preventable or avoidable had they been able to get the healthcare they deserved, and also had they had more motivation to go to the doctor in the first place, rather than, as many of us do, dreading it as a potential source of discrimination and shaming. So there's a lot there, and I'd also love to get those references that sound like it points to a very important issue, and also one that, again, we can make improvements here. Studies show that even modest amounts of education often substantially improve physician and other medical provider attitudes. And while the attitudes are not the only source by any means of the systemic problems, they are a source of some of the injustice, and they're also often a kind of bottleneck for further improvements to the overall system. So some of this is really bad, but potentially can be remedied with fairly rudimentary educational efforts. And it's great to hear that some of these are ongoing at your own institution.
So I have one more question that I really will make the last question over here.
Hi, my question is in regards to women leaders like Elizabeth Warren that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
To what extent do you think that having, for example, a woman president of the US is a win against misogyny, even though they're still operating under these larger patriarchal systems?
Yeah, good. I mean, to be frank, like, there are many women who, if they became president, would be not at all a strike against misogyny or patriarchy, because they in fact manifest and demonstrate patriarchal values. So there are lots of, as Andrea Dworkin called them, right-wing women, because she had a whole book about this phenomenon, who in fact are foot soldiers for the patriarchy, and whose election would be would strike no blow for feminist progress whatsoever. Someone like Giorgia Meloni, the newly elected and fascist Italian prime minister, would be an example like this. So I certainly hold that it is not sufficient to have a woman in a position of power like that in order to make feminist progress in terms of political, our conception of who can be a viable political authority. I do, though, think that it would be, a really big deal to have a woman who was both a representative of progressive feminist and other egalitarian values, and was able to show that political authority was compatible with womanhood. I'm not saying that it would change things overnight. She would incur an enormous amount of backlash and misogyny, and might even, as we saw unfortunately during Barack Obama's era, arguably usher in new forms of gender resentment parallel to the kind of racial resentment that his presidency arguably awakened in some Americans. But it is still not nothing. So I do hold out hope that someone who both independently deserves to lead because they have the plans and the appropriately communal spirit, which needn't be moral perfection, but certainly we do need to have caring, compassionate, and morally exemplary leaders. My hope is that someone who was all that and a woman could help gradually usher in a more expansive and gender inclusive conception of political authority. But look, I'm not expecting a left-wing woman president of my dreams anytime soon. I would be surprised if it happened in my lifetime. I think it is really, really a sticky problem. I think we'll see a right-wing woman president well before a left-wing one, if I had to make bets, which I wouldn't, because, you know, I'm a philosopher and not, you know, in the game of making kind of political predictions. But a lot of what allows women to have power is kowtowing to patriarchal norms and values that then mean that she'll be granted a modicum of power because she's not perceived as a threat to the broader structures that uphold male dominance.
On that happy note,
Sorry, it's not good news, but you know, the sooner we face it, the sooner we can fix it.
hey, thank you very much for being with us tonight, and thanks for students.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. You've been a wonderful audience, and I so appreciate the chance to talk about some of my ideas with you all.